Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine May, and I'm welcoming you today as an uninvited guest on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. As curator here at the Kelowna Art Gallery and on behalf of the board of directors and staff, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we operate, gather, and benefit every day on the land of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Tonight, we're concluding our pop art lecture series, which has been organized in conjunction with our current exhibition From Warhol to Banksy that is on display here at the Kelowna Art Gallery for just a few more days until October 16th. From Warhol to Banksy features over 120 works by some of pop art's most notable artists, all from the collection of a local collector and lawyer, Paul Mitchell, and his wife, Tracy Mitchell. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the support of these businesses for the presentation of From Warhol to Banksy. So thank you to RBC PH&N Investment Council, Pusher Mitchell LLP, and RBC Private Banking. Tonight, we are pleased to have Patrick Moore, the director of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, joining us in conversation about the life and times of Andy Warhol in all its complexities. Patrick Moore joined the Andy Warhol Museum in 2011. He held the role of Director of Development before becoming the Deputy Director and Managing Director. And Moore is a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University with degrees in theater direction and English lit. Moore has authored a number of books published with Beacon Press and Kensington, and his work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, Newsday, and the Advocate. So thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick. And just a reminder for everyone to please save your questions for the end of the talk. We'll have a 15-minute Q&A period, and at that time you can type your questions into the chat bar, and we will do our best to address them all in a timely manner. And I'll also let everybody know that today's lecture is being recorded, so it will be available for future viewing on our website. So let everybody know that they can watch it on Monday morning. So Patrick, thanks again for joining us. Today's format is going to be an interview, and I'll launch right into the questions. We're excited to hear all about your work and all about Andy Warhol. So to start, can you just tell us what initially ignited your interest in Andy Warhol?
Sure. My interest in Andy Warhol began in a very unusual way. I grew up in a very small town in the Midwest in Iowa, and I was a sort of disgruntled, unhappy, gay teenager in this small town in Iowa. And I turned on MTV. And suddenly there was this extraordinary television program called Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes that was on MTV. And it was like this magic portal into everything that I'd always dreamed of, but not known really existed. So the world of fashion, art, New York City, nightlife, and all of that mixing together as it does in Warhol's world. And that really ignited my passion for finding out who Warhol was and how I could be involved in his legacy, and in his world.
That's so interesting. I'm sure you're one of so many people who watched that show and found that connection kind of in a lonely place in their lives. And how did you get started in your career in the arts and eventually as the director of the Warhol Museum?
I did go to Carnegie Mellon, as you mentioned, and I thought, as one does when you're 16 or 17, that I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And when I got to Carnegie Mellon, I'd been accepted as a theater directing student, and I just felt like theater was not my path, but I also was not very interested in going back to Iowa. So I got my degree, and immediately when I graduated, moved to New York City, because Pittsburgh was a very different city then than it is now. And when I got to New York, I got a job in marketing at a place called The Kitchen, which is an experimental arts center in New York. And it's much more aligned with the visual arts than it is with performance and theater, actually. And as soon as I started working there and meeting artists and meeting gallerists and collectors, I just knew that I'd found my spot. And so that was my segue into the art world. And I worked in the art world for quite a long time. It was the 80s and a wonderful time, but a terrible time in New York City for the art world because it was the height of the AIDS crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But it was possible in the 1980s to feel like you were really part of the art world because it was so small then. It
Right.
basically took place below 14th Street in New York, as opposed to a global art world that we're accustomed to now. And because all of us were working on the same thing, which was being concerned about our friends and lovers who were affected by the AIDS crisis, I was able to meet really famous artists and really famous collectors and curators and
Mm,
made my way into the art world.
amazing. And how did you find your way to the Andy Warhol Museum?
It was a long and circuitous route. After 10 years in New York, I moved to Los Angeles for no particularly good reason other than it was January in New York and freezing cold. And I went on a business trip to LA and I thought, I'm moving to Los Angeles.
A good
So
reason, yeah.
I know you Canadians can identify with
We can
that.
relate, yeah.
Um, but I moved to LA and I wrote a couple of books, as you mentioned. And then I became a producer in
Mm,
California and worked for Yahoo doing things like producing Wolfgang Puck's cooking show. And it was really my husband who was working for Warner Brothers and wanted out of the entertainment industry
mm,
said let's go somewhere else, and we wanted to invest in real estate, and I said I know the land of cheap real estate,
right.
and it was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we moved back here, and frankly I needed a job, and
Mm-hmm.
I kind of woke up and remembered that I had worked in the art world, and I went to a performance here in Pittsburgh in a very beautiful old music hall, and it turned out it was put on by the Warhol Museum, and here you
Mm,
had this kind of historic hall, but all these young kids and hipsters. And it was just this fantastic mix. And I thought, I really should work at the Warhol Museum.
mm.
So I took the first job that was available.
That's amazing. It sounds kind of like it was meant to be. Right place at the right time in a way.
Yeah,
Um, well, let's talk a bit more about Warhol and his life. So, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about the silver factory. And if you could talk to us about Warhol's process of making prints in his factory, it's a question that we get a lot in the gallery in our exhibition, which is made up of primarily prints, and just the process of creating those.
yeah. Well, let's go back to some kind of founding principles of the factory and Warhol's production and his practice. There was a reason it was called the factory. It was a factory for making art. And Warhol was interested in this idea of how could he, in an almost mechanical way, make art. When he moved to New York City, he was not a fine artist, he was a commercial artist. And he was already experimenting with this. I hope people come and visit the Warhol Museum, and you'll see many, many examples of Warhol's commercial drawings, which have a funny, smudged line. And it's called the blotted line technique. And
Mm,
Warhol would basically make a drawing on one side of paper, and then fold it over and press it onto the other side. And it's a little bit like a very primitive printing press. You can make
mm,
multiple copies. And then if an editor said, oh, I love that flower drawing, but I want it in blue, not in red, ostensibly it was a kind of easier way of making more
right.
copies. So Warhol probably would have talked about it in that way. Oh, it's so easy. Oh, it's great. I can make a lot of them. I can change them. But it also had this quote unquote side effect of creating a very distinctive line for the drawings.
Mhm.
So that's a very early example of how Warhol's production techniques created a particular effect. And then, when Warhol segued into the art world, into the fine art world, he had not yet discovered the silkscreen. So
Mm,
he was still, if you look in our museum, for example, at the early Coca-Cola paintings, at the early Campbell soup can paintings,
Mhm.
you see not those pristine silk screened images that people may think of when they come to your exhibition, like the Marilyns, which are in your
Mhm.
exhibition,
Yeah.
but something that looks very messy and painterly and hand drawn and painted because it was. But over time, Warhol started to try to make things that looked more and more like advertising. And he literally, if you came to the factory, would put the messy version and the pristine version up on the wall and say, which one do you like?
Mm.
And apparently, the pristine version won the votes because it was a more radical gesture. It didn't look like anything that came before it.
Mhm.
So then, Warhol did not invent silkscreen printing, but it was a commercial process. And he was the first artist to utilize it to make his work. Other artists would later use it, of course. Warhol actually taught Robert Rauschenberg how to silkscreen print.
Mm. Wow.
But one can see this enormous change in Warhol's paintings. Let's not talk about prints yet, but
Right.
in Warhol's paintings when he began to embrace the silkscreen. So, if you were to look at the Elvises or the soup cans, for
Mhm.
example, uh, they then, with the silkscreen, began to look more and more like advertising. And as Warhol became more successful, he was interested, one, in how to broaden the base for his work, make it available to more people, but also, frankly, how to make more money. Because
Right.
Warhol was never, ever ashamed of making money. He
Mhm.
loved making money. He was a child of the Depression.
Yeah.
So if the material that people are seeing in your exhibition is primarily prints, then it's actually not a big leap between the Marilyn that sold for $195 million a few months back
Yeah.
and the beautiful prints that you have in your exhibition because they are made in much the same way. uh, the difference is their availability and the size of the edition.
Mhm.
And but it's a clear continuum with Warhol in a way that it's not often with a painter who also makes prints.
Right. So interesting. And I guess we can continue kind of along the same lines, talking about Warhol's use of commercial art. Why do you think his iconic imagery gets progressively more powerful with time? His images are so recognizable. Um, why do you think it's kind of held that power?
Well, if I were to show you, for example, the source material for the Maryland paintings, you would see a Hollywood publicity still, which is kind of three quarters of Marilyn, down
Right.
into her torso. And then there are black lines around it that just zoom in on her face.
Hmm.
So Warhol already was saying, I may find these source materials in mass media or in the commercial realm, but I'm going to focus in on the part of it that's most fascinating. But then an interesting thing happens. Warhol makes paintings that are actually very unlike that source material. So, for example, let's go back to the Marilyn images that are in your exhibition.
Hmm.
They are actually not beautiful in terms of Marilyn. They're
Right.
actually, if you really look at them, they're quite grotesque.
Yes.
She has these smeared lips, this garish eyeshadow. She's become distorted by
Hmm.
her fame. She has kind of passed through this lens into a different realm where she's not quite human anymore. She really is just an image smeared with color.
Hmm.
So I think that Warhol's use of imagery is far more complex than people give it credit for. And if you look at other sources of images, for example, some of my favorite paintings in our collection are the Death and Disaster series that are often of car crashes, for example.
Hmm.
And the image is repeated on the canvas often, sometimes many, many times, sometimes a couple of times. But if we think about our current contemporary culture of how we consume media, if we turn on the CBC or CNN in the morning and we see an image that is the disaster du jour, the first time we see it, it's shocking. Those images take our breath away.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, after they're repeated all day long, they change in terms of their meaning. We become used to them. They become either mundane or kind of sickening in a way.
Yeah.
And that I think is really what Warhol was getting at so early. I mean, in the 1960s, he's thinking about this, I believe.
Yeah.
So Warhol was prescient in terms of his selection of images, but then also how he treated the image.
Hmm. Hmm. And with Marilyn, because that is maybe one of the most popular, images that we associate with Warhol, do you think that his interest in her was also partly about the tragedy or her tragic life that she lived?
Absolutely, as it was in almost all of Warhol's great early paintings. He never painted a happy celebrity,
Yeah.
basically. But that particular painting, series of paintings, was done about a month after Marilyn's death.
Right.
So her death and the tragedy of her life, the poignancy of her life, was very fresh in the
Hmm.
minds of American culture. And we spend a lot of time thinking at the museum and have done several large exhibitions about Warhol's Catholicism. And I think that the Marilyn painting is very resonant. You have this kind of Madonna image in a way
Yeah.
that also becomes an image of a whore, taking on a lot of biblical tones.
Hmm.
And also, because with these celebrities, with this tragedy that surrounds many of them in Warhol's painting, we're reminded, I think, that very beautiful things often don't last. And
Yeah.
that's part of what makes them beautiful. So whether it's Marilyn, if Marilyn were 80 or 90 years old today, she would look very different. Part of
Mm.
what causes the fascination is she died in the kind of, greatest expression of her beauty and her
Yes.
glamour. It's much like a flower, and Warhol painted flowers, of course, too.
Hmm.
A flower is only beautiful because it only lasts for a few days. If it were to last forever, it would be a plastic flower. It would be something artificial.
Hmm. So interesting. Um, we'll talk a bit more about celebrity and Warhol's obsession with celebrity in a moment, but um, a lot of questions that come up in our exhibition, have to do with originals versus reproductions. So a lot of what he was making in the factory, which is different than how a lot of other artists approach their practice. So what would you say makes a Warhol print an original? And can you tell us about the significance of an artist's signature and a print edition?
Mhm. Well, an artist controls the edition. An artist may go through a series of test prints, things that aren't quite right. But as with most art, scarcity or control of the availability is important. So even for an artist like Warhol, who really wanted to democratize his market, it was important that there were only 100 of them, for example, that were the actual Marilyns, that were the real thing. Uh, and that seems, I would imagine, kind of false or odd to
Mhm.
people who aren't involved in the art world. But there is, to a certain extent, art is art because the artist says it is art. And I think that other artists in your exhibition, that's particularly true. Uh, so with Warhol, and I hope that you have some collectors who are involved in the museum and online tonight. It's really important to know that the work that you're buying is authentic. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to work with an auction house that has a
Mhm.
relationship with the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Um, Christie's is the best example of that.
Mhm.
They're the official dealer, as it were.
Mhm.
But those works are often stamped, no longer, but at one time they were often stamped. Now, Warhol didn't often sign his work, especially on the front,
Mm.
sometimes on the back, but a signature is not really the best indicator, I think, of authenticity
Oh, interesting.
because, you know, Warhol, for example, was a very social person. So he might have met you at a party and said, "Oh, you're so glamorous and you're
Mhm.
such a smart curator. And here's a little drawing and my signature." That easily could be a kind of memento of our evening together, of our friendship, but not necessarily an artwork that was intended to enter the
Mm.
commercial market.
Mhm.
So I think signatures are a little bit of a false flag when it comes to authenticity.
That's so interesting that you say that. We have a few objects in our exhibition that do have Andy Warhol's signature, and people are always fascinated by that. One of them is a pop-up book where he signed his name on one of the pages. One of them is a paper bag that was from a exhibition opening in the 60s, and he signed the front of that. But we do have a few prints that are editions that have his signature in the corner. But yeah, it's always a point of discussion for people who are visiting, of course, to see the artist's hand like that. But yeah, that's kind of good to know. So moving along, as we were talking about before, Warhol was known for his obsession with celebrity, whereas Banksy, who is the other main artist in our exhibition, prefers to remain totally anonymous. So despite Banksy's aversion to the public eye, he's created a successful brand that really rivals Warhol's and is recognizable around the world. So I'm wondering if you can speak to Warhol's fascination with celebrity culture, if that stemmed from his upbringing, and the difference between Banksy's approach.
Sure. Well, I think there's a massively different approach. And you're absolutely right that Warhol's fascination with celebrity, I believe, did start in his childhood. Pittsburgh, when Warhol was growing up here, was in some ways probably the wealthiest city in America, but
Hmm.
it was also very grim, very industrial, to the extent that at 11 o'clock in the morning, the street lamps would be on and it would look like it was nighttime because there
Hmm.
was so much pollution
Wow.
in the city. Men would go to work uh, and bring a second white shirt with them and
Hmm.
change their shirt halfway through the day. So if you think about Warhol, who is associated with this kind of glamorous world of Studio 54 and hanging out with Liza Minnelli, his
Right.
childhood could not have been more different from that. And it was compounded by the fact that he was the child of a very poor immigrant family that had almost nothing. So in this world of a dark and sooty Pittsburgh, his escape often was going to the movies. And
Hmm.
he would go to the cinema, often with his brothers, and be transported from industrial Pittsburgh into the silver screen and
Mhm.
this fantasy of the way life might be. That was compounded by Warhol having his brothers write off to the Hollywood studios for him and get autographed movie
Right.
star photos. And we have his early childhood autograph albums with all of those photos,
Hmm.
especially of Shirley Temple, who was his favorite. So we have that aspect of celebrity, but then also if you think about the church, because Warhol was not only a Catholic, but Byzantine Catholic, there's this idea of, in the Byzantine Catholic Church, there's something called the iconostasis, which is a screen that's in front of the altar.
Hmm.
And it has portraits of the saints. And if you think about the framing of those portraits, the kind of use of color and gold leaf, the
Mm.
flatness of the image, it's actually not far off in some ways to think about some of Warhol's portraits, like Marilyn. So I think that that was the spark for celebrity culture. And also, I think it was compounded when Warhol moved to New York and was a commercial illustrator, because the art world in New York and in the United States in the late 1950s, early 1960s was incredibly homophobic.
Mm.
So when Warhol arrived in New York, he was roundly rejected by the so-called traditional art world, but he was embraced and enveloped by the world of fashion and fashion illustration, which was ruled by women.
Mm.
So you have this world of, Harper's Bazaar and Mademoiselle and the New York Times Fashion
Mm.
supplement, which kind of feels a little bit more like celebrity culture
Yeah.
than, uh, you know, uh, Robert Rauschenberg's view on it, or even earlier, Jackson Pollock throwing paint around. That's an emotional tone that's very different than Warhol's world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if we come to Banksy, it's kind of an enormous leap uh, because Warhol, I think, along with Picasso, Warhol's greatest contribution was this idea that I'm going to create a persona for myself. And that persona is actually a part of my artistic practice. To understand my paintings, you have to also deal with my persona. And my persona is going to be uh, off putting or glamorous or whatever it might be, but it's something different than me, the private person. And I think that Warhol and Picasso both did that. So Banksy must be at the opposite end of that
Mm.
spectrum of not only using anonymity, but really depending on anonymity
Right.
for the artistic production that he's a part of. If we knew who Banksy was, Banksy wouldn't exist.
Right.
So,
You would have
and
been arrested long ago.
he would have been arrested, or people maybe not might not have been so interested in his work because there was that mystery. And
Yeah.
people were also similarly interested in Warhol's work because he would go on television with sunglasses on and mumble and not speak, and people were thinking, well, who is this person? Why is he so
Yeah.
odd? What's his story? So the persona adds to the equation,
Hmm.
and I think that Banksy's anonymity is his persona.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that does make total sense. There's something mysterious about both of them,
Yeah.
leaving you kind of wanting to know more. Before we move on to the next question, you did mention this his childhood photo collection and archives that he kept of celebrities, and I remember seeing those in person and finding them, I mean, overwhelming. There's so much that he collected in terms of like celebrity photos and autographs and that kind of thing. Can you just tell us quickly a bit about what you do at the museum in your archives um, to, when you took all of that personal collection of Warhol's, do you display it for the public, or how would we be able to see that
Um,
information?
we do display it for the public, and as you know from your experience with us, it's also part of traveling exhibitions.
Hmm.
There are different parts to the archival collection. The archival collection is almost 500,000 objects.
Wow.
So it is this sprawling beast in some ways. It has been very challenging to digitally
Mm.
document it because it's such a large number of objects. But there are different parts. So there are things that, like the childhood material, and also material from the Warhol family,
Mhm.
things that most of us would probably lose along the way, but because Warhol was such a pack rat, he kept them. Uh,
Yeah.
then you move into material that's related to the artwork. So that's why we have the original source material for so many of
Yeah.
the great artworks that Warhol
So
created.
fascinating.
But then, kind of most fascinating and perplexing are the time capsules. And the time capsules were really a kind of attempt by Warhol's assistants to make sense of all of this
Hmm.
stuff that he would accumulate every single day. And then when they were ready to move to a new studio, he was on the cheap side.
Hmm.
So he didn't want to move, hire professional packers and movers. And they said, Andy, we are going to make time capsules of all of this because someday people are going to be so fascinated in you. And Warhol loved this idea.
Yeah.
He thought, I'm going to sell them. He was originally going to sell them, I think, for $1,500 a box.
Hmm.
So there are more than 600 of them that were not sold, and they came to us at the museum, and they are considered, in their totality, a work of art,
Yeah.
serial work of art, and they are completely nuts. So you'll have original Basquiat drawings in them, but
Wow.
then you'll have, a bottle of Coca-Cola
Hmm.
or old correspondence of, all sorts, important correspondence, but also bills that were unpaid.
Hmm.
One of them says on the front, "Pay up, you cheapskate." Warhol loved to take the Concorde, but it was expensive. So he took everything he could off of the Concorde with him when he got off. We have sets of china from the Concorde,
Wow.
salt and pepper packets, toothpicks, air sick bag, and
Wow.
it's all jumbled together. And it really does become a portrait of a person's life.
That is so interesting. Yeah, those time capsules are amazing. It's great that you have so many of them too.
Yeah.
Um, okay, our next question is about one of the more interesting works in our exhibition, which is part of the Ladies and Gentlemen series.
Mm,
So the one that we have is a print of Vicky Peters. And it was really difficult to research and find information about Vicky Peters. So I'm wondering if you could provide some insight into the Ladies and Gentlemen series kind of in general, and speak a bit about Warhol's relationship to the queer community.
sure. The Ladies and Gentlemen series is fascinating on almost every level. And if people aren't aware, this is a series of portraits of what we now call transgendered women, but at the time were called drag queens.
Hmm.
And Warhol, this was not Warhol's idea. An Italian collector commissioned the series. And Warhol, being Warhol, he looked for the easiest way to do it. So he started with trying to dress up poor Bob Colacello in a wig and makeup. And Bob Colacello is a fantastic person, but he is not a pretty lady. So Warhol's like, well, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So Warhol's assistants went to a club in Times Square called the Gilded Grape, where a lot of transgendered women would go, and they would find friendships and probably a little bit of money along the way. And Warhol invited these transgendered women to be painted. And we have to remember these were not these were people living on the edges of
Hmm.
society in the 1960s and 1970s. And at the same time as Warhol is painting royalty and the richest, most famous, most glamorous people in the world, he's also painting these transgendered women.
Hmm.
And he becomes fascinated with the subject and does far more of these paintings, prints, drawings, photographs than he's commissioned to do. And the way in which he paints the transgendered women is really quite extraordinary because the paint on many Warhol paintings is quite thin. It's very flat.
Hmm.
But you can imagine that these transgendered ladies were not sparing in their application of makeup. And
Right.
in the same way, Warhol slathers on the paint on these paintings, but it's not garish. There's a kind of power and a dignity to them
Yeah.
in their gaze, in the way that they are kind of composed on the canvas. And we own a lot of this work, and it is among the most influential work for young artists
Wow.
because, as we know, race and gender are at the center of so much of what we think about in
Yeah.
contemporary society. So, Warhol, in some ways, was not deep when it came
Hmm.
to his thinking around race and also sexuality. But on the other hand, he was so far ahead of his time in terms of being willing to embrace that particular subject
Hmm.
that he kind of got a jump start, I think, on a lot of what we are talking about today. Warhol, as a gay man himself, was never really in the closet, but he was certainly not
Hmm.
somebody we would consider an activist. I
Right.
think I think Andy just never kind of figured out how to be in the closet. For
Hmm.
some people, we don't have that luxury because we never figure it out. And
Yeah.
if you look at the early drawings that Warhol did in New York that he tried to show in art galleries, they were outrageously provocative. Not only
Really.
were they kind of some of them of rough trade, but there are genitalia with
Hmm.
ribbons around it. And so he's either very, very brave and provocative or completely naive. And it's a
Hmm.
little bit hard to say which is which.
Well, thank you for that. It's information that, as I said, was so difficult to find, but I love learning about that series. And yeah, I agree. It's something that so many people who visit our exhibition and so many of us who work here were interested in right away and in knowing more. So thank you.
I'll say one other thing about
Yeah.
it. Until quite recently, the women in the
Mhm.
Ladies and Gentlemen series were unknown. And
Oh,
it's taken
really?
a lot of sleuthing to even just get their names, but
Okay.
some of them are incredibly important figures in queer history. Primarily, a woman who I knew in New York, Marcia P. Johnson, Marcia Pay It No Mind Johnson,
Oh my
who
gosh.
was
Yeah.
one of the first and greatest transgender activists, and she's the subject of many of the paintings.
Wow. Not as much information about Vicky Peters, but that's great that I think there seven that were
I
featured,
believe,
I think.
yes.
Yeah, so that's definitely an interesting point of research to figure out, where those women are now. And speaking of women, something that I've been thinking about in this show, is women in pop art. And we don't have any, in the Paul and Tracy Mitchell collection that are on view in our exhibition right now. But a rival of Warhol's in the 60s is considered to be Kusama, who did battle sexism and racism in America and really never had success during that period of time. And that's just one of, I'm sure, many examples. But can you talk about women in pop art or women who may have influenced Warhol's work?
Sure. I wouldn't pick Kusama as maybe the example that would come to mind for me. I would pick an artist named Marisol.
Yeah.
Uh, Marisol, when she met Warhol in the early 1960s, was far more famous than he was.
Hmm.
She was at the zenith of uh, the art world and world famous and being featured in publications. And we just did an exhibition of Marisol and Warhol that went from our museum to the Perez Art Museum in Miami. Marisol uh, did do some work that referenced Warhol directly. She actually did a quite beautiful sculptural portrait of him.
Hmm.
But I think that she really influenced Warhol more than the other way around.
Hmm.
Marisol was famous for her beauty, her dark raven hair, her white skin, her sunglasses, but most importantly, for her silence.
Hmm.
She simply did not speak. And many people credit Marisol for being the inspiration for Warhol's kind of shut down blank
Oh,
persona.
yeah.
And it's a terrible tragedy, actually, that in the 1960s and well beyond, uh, there were so few women artists who were recognized. And Marisol had this kind of horrible double-edged sword with her beauty,
Mm.
because she was beautiful and she was glamorous and very fashionable. People didn't take her seriously. They were more
Yeah.
interested in saying, "Oh, Marisol, who are you dating?" Or "Marisol, what kind of dress do you like?" Than looking at this work that's actually super dark
Right.
and quite disturbing, and quite sad in some ways.
Mhm.
So Warhol was very much around Marisol, and he made films of Marisol. There are beautiful
Mm.
screen tests of Marisol.
Yeah.
So anybody who's listening who is not aware of Marisol's work, I really would encourage you to just Google her uh,
Yeah.
and see about this incredible artist who was largely kind of forgotten
Mm.
by the world, but really was as famous as Andy Warhol at one point.
Mm. I'm sure we'll all be Googling her tonight. I will be. Yeah, thank you for that. It sounds like you are doing some work at the museum, and your team there is um, finding ways to show Warhol's work alongside other artists, not just women. But do you want to tell us about the approach you're taking to exhibitions and um, showing Warhol's work with other contemporary artists, perhaps?
We have done exhibitions where we literally mix Warhol's work with the work of a contemporary artist,
Hmm.
probably most ambitiously with Ai Weiwei. And we
Oh, yeah.
took over the entire museum in a nightmarish installation process, and we installed a
Yeah.
permanent collection and inserted Ai Weiwei. That was before I became director, and I kind of think that it doesn't do as much service to the other artists as having the permanent collection. And then we have a floor for temporary exhibitions.
Hmm.
Having the work of especially I'm more interested in emerging artists,
Yeah.
having their work uh, be given the kind of respect of their own exhibition, but it's taking place in the Andy Warhol Museum.
Right. Right.
And, I adore Ai Weiwei. I adore his work. But did we fundamentally change the trajectory of Weiwei's career by giving him an exhibition? Probably not. He has a lot going on in the world.
Yes, he sure does.
Whereas if we can give a young artist their first museum exhibition, we can fundamentally change the course of their life and their career.
Oh, what an opportunity. Yeah, that seems like the right approach. That's amazing.
So that's
Yeah,
more what we do now
it's great.
at the museum. And I must say, it's a lot of fun and very
Yeah.
fulfilling.
Oh, yeah, that sounds amazing. Um, in your own words, this will be the last question, I think, before we open it up to the audience here. But in your own words, why do you think Warhol's legacy is so important to document?
Is so important to what? I'm
Is
sorry.
so important to document.
Ah, well, because it's ongoing. It's
Mm.
Warhol is alive in contemporary culture, and he is deeply fascinating to young people, um, perhaps more so than any other artist of his fame. But I think that Warhol was first in several areas. One, Warhol didn't just want to be a painter. He wanted to draw. He
Mm.
wanted to make prints. He wanted to make films. He wanted to manage the Velvet Underground. He wanted to
Mm.
start Interview Magazine. He wanted to have shows on MTV.
Yeah.
He wanted to explore every possible means of creativity, and he did. So Warhol was groundbreaking in that way. And I think that that may be a little bit what young people respond to. Warhol was, people talk about Warhol as a mirror, and he was reflective of his time. And I think that, young people, especially with digital media, are out there documenting their world too.
Right.
They're like, I may be doing this, but I'm also a photographer today.
Hmm.
There's a freedom in with youth today that I think responds to Warhol's work. And that's
Yeah.
why it's important to not just document Warhol's work, but to make sure that it remains current and living.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I know people still find it deeply resonates with them, people of all ages. So that does make sense. I'm going to open the floor to any questions that we may have from our attendees. So for anyone who has questions, please type them in to the message chat board, and we will ask Patrick. In the meantime, Patrick, do you want to tell us what exhibitions are going on at the museum right now?
Yeah, we just a few weeks ago opened a new temporary exhibition that is not by another artist, but is a deep dive look into Interview magazine.
Oh,
We have the only full set, the full run of Interview,
yeah.
those first couple of hundred issues that were so influential. And this looks at Interview, the portraits that were on the cover of Interview, which were actually not portraits painted by Warhol,
Mm,
but by another artist named Richard Bernstein. So
mm,
it's also an attempt to kind of correct history a little bit.
right. Oh, we have a message that popped up. Do you have any info on Warhol's relationship with Sister Corita Kent, the pop art nun?
Yes, we actually did an exhibition of Sister Corita Kent,
Hmm.
and I don't think that they had a direct relationship, but I think that they were aware of one another. They could not be more different in a way, in the way that they use silkscreen printing, because, of course, Sister Corita's messages were about social activism, about spirituality. Of course, there is a kind of common tie in the through Catholicism, but it was expressed in a very different way. But I think that if you look at Corita Kent's work, you do see the influence of Warhol in terms of the colors that she chose, the kind of reflection of her time, what culture looked like at that moment. So I adore her work.
Hmm. Great, thank you. Anyone else who has questions, feel free to ask them now. And I'll ask you one more question, Patrick, as well. We didn't really talk about Warhol's film and video work. Do you want to just talk briefly about, the kind of work that he produced in film and video?
Yeah, I would love to because it's a great passion of mine.
Mm.
People think that they've seen Warhol films, but what most people have seen are films that Warhol produced, but that were actually directed by Paul Morrissey. And they had a wider commercial release. So films like Trash and Heat
Mhm.
and Flesh, those were produced by Warhol, but not directed by him. True Warhol films are really something because they started with the screen tests, which were a different way of making a portrait of somebody,
Mhm.
because he would sit you in front of a camera, an old Bolex camera, and for the length of a roll of film, which at that point was 3.5 minutes, he'd say, "Don't do anything." And
Yeah.
he might even walk away from the camera. And 3.5 minutes is actually a surprisingly long amount of time
Yes.
to be staring into a camera. So people begin to do funny things. Sometimes he would say to the person, "Try not to blink." So here you have this silent portrait of a person with tears running down their eyes,
Mm.
down their face, but there's no emotion actually. It's just that they were trying not to blink.
Yeah.
And the screen tests are slowed slightly, so they have a dreamy quality. That's one body of really fantastic Warhol film.
Mm.
And then famously, people probably know about Empire and Sleep, these very long films, 6 hours or 8 hours, that are sometimes described as structural films or durational films or endurance films,
Mm.
where Warhol is making a different kind of portrait. Empire follows the Empire State Building from the uh, the city becoming dark, the lights coming on the Empire State Building, and then the sun rising again. So it becomes a portrait not only of the Empire State Building, but really of New York City, Warhol's
Yeah.
adopted home.
Yeah.
And then there are some really nutty films that were a little bit more narrative, if you want to call it that, but they were also showing a side of culture that most people had never experienced, the world of drag queens, the world
Yeah.
of gay people having sex, of interracial couples having making out with one another, things that really kept Warhol on the very edge of the art world. He never
Yes.
wanted to, be considered somebody who just was, had lost it and was kind of resting on his laurels.
Hmm.
He wanted that edge, and the films really provide that.
Yeah. Where would he have screened those films at the time? Or how would people have seen them?
Many of them were screened at anthology film archives in New York and
Okay.
in other kind of locations that were receptive to experimental film
Hmm.
in New York City. And there was a big scene. But then, most famously, the Chelsea Girls actually had a huge release. It went all around the country and all around the world, a lot of times on college campuses. And Chelsea Girls was, some people say that it may have been the precursor to reality television
Huh.
because it ostensibly gave you a look inside
Right.
the Chelsea Hotel and all these outrageous characters. Of course, the whole thing is staged
Mhm.
and manipulated, much like reality television is.
Right. I know some of the stars of his films as well, kind of shot to fame in a way after he found them. Were these friends of his that he met, other artists, or and most of them weren't for like, traditional actors? Do you know how he kind of found the stars of his films?
Yeah, well, we have to remember that the factory was kind of the center of the universe at that
Hmm.
time. And it was not a closed world. Before Warhol was shot, pretty much anybody could come to the factory.
Right.
So people like Edie Sedgwick, for example, were brought to the factory by a friend because they were young and beautiful, and the factory was the place for young and beautiful to be.
Right.
They were not, as you say, traditional actors, and Warhol didn't want traditional actors. He wanted people who were super edgy, sometimes quite beautiful, but sometimes quite grotesque in the way that they presented themselves.
Hmm.
Anybody who riveted the screen, that's what Warhol wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, it looks like we don't have other questions coming in. So thank you for everyone for joining us. And thank you so much, Patrick. I feel like I learned a lot. So interesting to hear kind of those details about Warhol's early years and a lot more in-depth information about some of the work that we have in our exhibition. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Um, Again, for everyone who is attending, you're welcome to view the recording of this interview on Monday morning. We'll have it up on our website. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Patrick.
Absolutely my pleasure, and congratulations on your exhibition.
Thanks so much and have a great night.
All right.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.